Imagine a military tent, hastily erected on the banks of the freezing Danube River. Outside, snow blankets the ground and settles upon funeral pyres that still smolder faintly with smoke. Far away, the drums of the Germanic tribes echo, steady, heavy, like the breathing of a world exhausted by war and plague. Inside the tent, the weak glow of an oil lamp illuminates a solitary man, wrapped in a thick cloak, pen in hand, the ink already beginning to congeal from the cold. He is the emperor of the Roman Empire, and he is also a human being, writing to himself. We often think of power as a summit, as a throne, as glory, as the ability to command the world into motion. But perhaps what we think about power has been wrong. Sometimes power is not a radiant peak, but a cold room, a place with no escape, a place that forces a person to confront himself, in silence amid the stench of death and the unending sound of war. The man in that tent does not write to secure his name in history. He does not write for posterity. He writes to avoid collapse. Around him stretches a vast empire, yet one that is fragile. To the east, war with Parthia has just ended, bringing back victory, and an invisible plague now spreading through the cities. To the north, the Danube frontier trembles under waves of invasion. Tens of thousands die each year, not only by sword and spear, but by fate itself, by forces beyond the control of any emperor. And at the center of all this, Marcus Aurelius sits down, opens the page, and asks himself, how must a person live when he cannot abandon power, yet does not wish to be corrupted by it? This is not merely the story of an emperor. It is the story of an ordinary human being placed in extraordinary circumstances, enduring long years of loss, war, and disease, and through an element that seems small, yet is relentlessly enduring. Inner discipline, he transformed war into wisdom, and power into a vital lesson on how to be human. Welcome to deep sleep of power, where stories of power are not told to be admired, but to be listened to slowly before drifting into sleep. If you feel these stories deserve to continue, stay with us and walk alongside the channel. In the next part, we will leave that frozen tent behind and travel back to Rome, where a child is born amid privilege and the noise of empire, unaware that his entire life will become a prolonged exercise in endurance, observation, and the art of governing himself. Leaving behind the frozen tent on the banks of the Danube, the story slowly retreats, passing back through war and plague, returning to a city louder than any other in the ancient world. Rome, a city that never slept. Not because it was peaceful, but because too many things collided at once. Rome of that era was an undisciplined symphony, the sound of hooves striking marble, the cries of merchants mingling with the voices of slaves, gold-adorned villas standing beside damp, shadowed alleys. There, power and poverty were never separate. They brushed shoulders every day, like two sides of the same coin. And at the heart of that city, a child was born into privilege. The boy lacked nothing the material world could offer. A distinguished family, a respected lineage, a future quietly arranged by others from a very early age. Yet precisely because of this, he grew up beneath an invisible pressure. The pressure of expectations, of watchful eyes, of having to become someone before he had even understood who he was. Strangely, amid all that noise, the boy developed an uncommon ability early on to listen, not to listen in order to reply, but to observe. He noticed the weary faces behind lavish ceremonies. He heard fragments of the poor slipping through the gates of great houses. And in that young mind, a tiny seed began to form. The seed of sensitivity to the suffering of others. Not everyone born into privilege sees such things. Many learn to look away. This boy did not. There is a detail that seems trivial, yet lingers long in the story. In a vast home, with cool stone floors and soft beds, the boy chose to sleep on a hard surface. Not out of asceticism to be praised, simply a quiet choice, as if he were saying to himself, "Do not let comfort make you forget a reality." This was not yet philosophy. It was a reflex. Rome taught people many things, but rarely how to be silent. The city constantly demanded display, status, speech, loyalty, even morality. Yet within that current, the boy learned an early lesson. To preserve inner silence is a form of strength. To older listeners, this lesson may sound familiar. The longer one lives, the more one understands that noise does not equal meaning. There are years spent in clamor that leave no deep trace in the soul, and that there are tiny, tranquil moments that shape an entire person. The boy grew up in a constant tension between two worlds, a world of ritual and glory, and a world of flesh and blood human beings. That tension forged in him a rare habit, seeing the human before the role, a quiet habit that would later become the foundation for an entirely different understanding of power. No one at the time called it progressive. No one applauded. It existed only as an undercurrent, slow and enduring. Time passed. The boy stepped beyond childhood, carrying with him memories of Rome, not merely as an empire, but as a living lesson in the fragility of order. The more power concentrated, the louder the noise became. And within that noise, without an inner anchor, it was easy for a person to lose himself. Perhaps for that reason, later in life, when faced with war and plague, he did not seek answers from the outside world. He had learned, very early on, to turn inward. But before becoming a man capable of self-observation, the boy would have to face his first lesson in loss. A lesson that came not from philosophers or books, but from what no one can evade, death. And in that moment, in the next part of the story, he would be forced to understand that even privilege cannot bargain with impermanence. And from there, the inner path would truly begin. There are lessons that require no explanation. They arrive quietly, without permission, without waiting for a person to be ready. And often the first lesson of life takes the shape of a loss. For a child growing up amid the privileges of Rome, that lesson came very early. His father passed away when the boy was still too young to fully grasp the meaning of absence, yet old enough to sense a void that could not be named. It was not a violent grief erupting into tears, but a sudden silence, as if the vast house had lost something that had always been there every single day. Death, in the world of adults, is often wrapped in ritual, farewells, and words of comfort repeated across generations. But in the mind of a child, death has no form. It is simply non-return. One morning, someone is gone from the familiar order of life, and nothing can place them back where they once were. In Rome's noble families, death still occurred, but it was rarely allowed to disturb the appearance of order. Rituals were conducted with precision. People continued their duties. The empire did not pause for a single individual, and within that cold continuity, a quiet lesson was planted in the boy's mind. No position stands high enough to negotiate with time. Impermanence does not choose its subjects. It does not distinguish between royalty and commoners. It simply comes and goes on its own terms. For many people, it is not until the latter half of life when hair has turned gray and steps have slowed, that they gradually understand how everything can be lost. But for this boy, that awareness arrived earlier, when the heart was still young, and the sense of stability had barely taken root. That early arrival shaped a different way of seeing the world, not pessimistic, but clear-eyed. He began to understand, even if he could not yet put it into words, that what we possess is not permanent property, but something borrowed for an undefined span of time. What is here today may be gone tomorrow, and therefore, how we meet the present matters more than clinging to the illusion of control. Rome taught people how to build against time. Marble, temples, laws, all carried ambitions of permanence. But the death of his father taught the boy the opposite lesson. What must be built first is not outward immortality, but an inward capacity to accept finitude. There is no evidence that the boy sank into prolonged grief. Yet there are also no signs of hurried forgetting. The loss remained like a low, steady undertone, not loud, but deep enough to shape every later thought. It taught him that emotions need not be suppressed, but neither must they be displayed. They can be carried quietly, as part of one's living baggage. For listeners who have passed through many seasons of life, this feeling is likely familiar. Everyone eventually reaches a moment when they realize that life is not guaranteed, that those we love may leave before we have spoken all that remains unsaid. And from that realization, if one is fortunate, comes a gentler way of living, slower, softer, and less judgmental. The death of his father also brought another more subtle recognition. The safety promised by power is only relative. An empire may protect its borders, but it cannot protect human beings from the laws of nature. This understanding would later spare him a dangerous illusion, the belief that supreme power equals omnipotence. Not everyone who experiences early loss becomes reflective. Many grow hardened, others withdraw entirely. But in this case, loss became a constant reminder. Live in such a way that when the inevitable arrives, there is no regret for having lived too lightly. From this point, the boy entered a new stage of life. No longer merely a child of privilege, but a human being beginning to carry an awareness of finitude. That awareness would not make him fear the world. On the contrary, it would help him see it more clearly, with fewer illusions and perhaps with greater compassion. Yet for that awareness not to become a burden, he needed an anchor, an adult who would not simply replace what had been lost, but help him learn how to transform an understanding of impermanence into responsibility rather than despair. And it is there, in the next part of the story, that the figure of his grandfather will appear, as a quiet moral pillar, teaching the boy that when the world cannot guarantee anything, the way we choose to act is the only thing truly within our control. After the death of his father, the boy's world did not collapse, but it grew quieter. The great movements of life continued outside. Rome remained noisy, rituals were still performed, power kept operating, but inwardly, he entered an emptiness that needed to be filled, not with words of consolation, but with a presence steady enough to replace what had been lost. And it was within that silence that his grandfather appeared, not as an influential figure stepping onto the stage with dazzling authority. On the contrary, his presence was gentle. Few words, few gestures, little display. In a world accustomed to proving worth through voice and status, this grandfather taught by living. He did not speak much about morality. He allowed morality to reveal itself through small choices, through unnoticed manners, through responsibilities carried without an audience. For a child who had already encountered impermanence, this became an essential anchor. The grandfather did not attempt to soften the loss with empty promises. He did not deny sorrow, but he also did not allow it to become the center. Instead, he placed before the boy something else, the order of responsibility. When someone departs, the world does not stop. The task of those who remain is to continue living in such a way that what remains of life does not become meaningless. In the home where the boy grew up with his grandfather, silence was not absence. It was space for thought. Few people monitored one another's minds, few judgments, little unnecessary interference. That quiet allowed a child to observe the world without being prematurely imposed upon. The grandfather understood something deeply. Morality cannot be forced. It must be witnessed. The boy learned that privilege is not a license for indulgence, but a reminder of obligation. That being born into a distinguished family does not mean living more easily, but living more carefully. Every action carries consequences. Every choice bears weight beyond oneself. This was not a lesson that excites. It was a lesson that slows a person down. To older listeners, this may sound familiar. The further one travels in life, the more one understands that freedom lies not in doing whatever one wishes, but in the capacity to carry out what one must do without resentment. The grandfather, through the way he lived, offered the boy a very different definition of strength. The strength of consistency. No need for brilliance, no need for praise. Only the quiet commitment to do what must be done, day after day, with integrity. In an empire accustomed to celebrating conquest and reputation, this was a form of education that was silent, yet profound. It taught the boy that power, if it arrives, should not be treated as a reward, but as a burden to be carried properly. And that morality is not something to be performed in public, but something that appears most clearly when no one is watching. From his grandfather, the boy learned how to observe himself before observing others. Before judging the world, ask whether one has fulfilled one's own duty. This is a difficult lesson because it does not confer a sense of superiority, but it creates a firm foundation, one that would later, when standing amid supreme power, prevent him from being swept away by illusions of the self. The grandfather did not live long enough to witness the boy become emperor, yet his influence did not require such a witness. It had already remained behind, like a low, steady voice within, reminding him that every position in life comes with an obligation, and that a person's dignity is measured not by what they possess, but by how they behave when no one compels them. As time passed, the boy would leave that quiet household and step into a far more complex world, the world of court life, of politics, of words that could save a person or destroy an entire life. And to survive in that world, he would need more than foundational values. He would need to be equipped with ways of thinking, with the ability to distinguish what is surface from what is essential. For that reason, in the next part of the story, teachers will appear, not to replace the ethics of responsibility that his grandfather had planted, but to sharpen them. They will teach him how to see through the purple robes of power and to understand that behind every dazzling symbol are fragile human beings, needing to be understood and governed with both intelligence and self-mastery. Once the moral foundation of responsibility had been laid through the quiet example of his grandfather, the boy's life entered a different phase, one in which the world no longer merely required him to live correctly, but began to demand that he speak truthfully. And in the Roman court, where words could open the path to power or close an entire destiny, truth was not always welcome. It was here that a name began to follow him like a shadow. Veracious, the most truthful one. This was not a title for someone who spoke bluntly without thought, nor was it a reward for naivete. It was how others recognized in him a rare habit, the habit of not avoiding the truth, even when that truth placed him at a disadvantage. In an environment where people learned early how to conceal, bend, and embellish their words, this habit was like a slight rise on an otherwise smooth road, not loud, but impossible to ignore. He did not try to prove that he was honest. He simply was not accustomed to speaking otherwise. When he made a mistake, he admitted it. When he did not know, he said he did not know. When he was not ready, he did not pretend to be certain. These seemingly simple acts became, within the court, a powerful signal. They drew attention, and they also inspired caution. That attention eventually reached the emperor, not because the boy was exceptionally clever or eloquent, but because he was trustworthy. In an empire sustained by oaths, reports, and promises, trustworthiness was a rarer asset than gold. And when the empire required a successor not merely to continue a bloodline, but to preserve stability, that trust became a decisive factor. What mattered was this: he did not treat truth as an abstract value. He treated it as a daily discipline, not something to be invoked when convenient and set aside when inconvenient. Every day, in every small matter, became an opportunity to practice not distorting reality, like someone training for long journeys who needs not think of the destination, only of keeping a steady breath. He maintained his rhythm of honesty without display. For listeners who have lived through many years, this invites a familiar reflection. Truth is not what we proclaim in grand moments, but what we practice in small situations when no one forces us to act rightly. And from such small habits, character slowly forms, firm like a bodily habit. In politics, many learn to treat truth as a tool. When it serves them, they call it a principle. When it does not, they call it naivete. But the boy known as Veracious learned something different. Truth is what prevents those in power from deceiving themselves. Once a person begins to bend the truth for convenience, they also start to believe the stories they themselves invent. And that is the moment when power becomes dangerous. The Roman court understood the art of concealment well, but it also understood that an empire cannot stand for long if the person at its center cannot distinguish flattery from reality. For this reason, the boy's honesty was not discarded. It was retained, nurtured, and gradually incorporated into the design of succession. Truth, however, does not offer comfort. It does not win more friends. It does not shield one from suspicious glances, but it grants a quiet benefit, inner clarity. When one does not have to remember having said something different from what one believes, the mind becomes lighter. And for someone destined to bear an entire empire, that lightness was not a luxury, but a condition for survival. At a very young age, he learned something many realize only too late. Power does not fear truth. It fears the moment when the one who holds it can no longer tell what is real from what is false. When truth becomes a habit, power can be placed in its proper position, as a tool that serves order rather than a mirror that magnifies the ego. The name Veracious did not make him perfect. It simply reminded him that each day, regardless of position, he could choose not to betray himself. And in a world where people readily sacrifice truth for convenience, that choice marked the first step toward a far more enduring form of power. Yet truth, if not carried within the proper structure, can become a burden. To take it further, he needed more careful preparation, not only in ethics but in learning how to see through the symbols of power, how to use language responsibly, and how to understand that words, when paired with authority, can save lives or wound an entire generation. And it is precisely there, in the next part of the story, that he enters an education designed not to make him the most brilliant, but to make him the clearest sighted. An education for those who would one day wear the purple and learn how not to let its color blind their eyes. There are moments in life that are neither loud nor dramatic, that carry no unmistakable mark of a turning point. Yet when viewed from a great distance, one comes to understand that such moments quietly closed one path and opened another, one from which there could be no return. The adoption unfolded in this way. There was no thunder, no solemn proclamation, only a sequence of decisions made in closed rooms by people accustomed to viewing the world from above. To them, this was not the story of a child, but a calculation of empire. Who would succeed? Who could be trusted? Who might preserve order when time carried away those standing at the center? And so, the boy's fate was placed into the hands of history. From that moment, private life began to recede, not all at once, not with a door slammed shut, but through minimal, steady changes, like layers of new garments placed upon him without asking. His manner of dress changed. His speech was refined. Relationships were rearranged. Even the future, something vague for every child, now became so clearly defined that there was no room left for imagination. The adoption was not merely a transfer of status. It was a process of reshaping a human being. The boy was no longer permitted to live as an individual in search of himself. He began to be prepared as a tool, not in a cold sense, but in a functional one. Every admirable quality was preserved. Every excess edge was gradually smoothed. Every emotion too personal was set aside, placed in a more discreet space. In Roman society, adoption was not an act of affection, but a political design. It allowed the empire to move beyond the limits of bloodline and select the most suitable person for the most necessary role. At a systemic level, this was a rare form of wisdom. But at the human level, it was a quiet trade-off. The boy was granted a vast future in exchange for the right to live an ordinary life. From this point, he learned an early lesson about power. The stability of the system is always placed above individual freedom. No one asked whether he was ready. No one required an answer. Within the logic of empire, an individual's readiness was something to be forged over time. And he accepted this, not out of resignation, but out of understanding. That understanding was not political knowledge, but a form of inner maturity. He realized that there are roles in life that are not chosen, but assigned. And once transferred, the only way not to be crushed is to learn how to carry them properly. The adoption also brought another loss, more subtle in nature, the loss of the right to fail in private. From now on, every mistake could become a precedent. Every shortcoming would be examined under the light of expectation. There was no longer space for the harmless experiments of youth, no room for failures that no one noticed. Every step left a trace. For those who have lived through many years, this will sound familiar. As responsibility increases, the margin for error narrows. One is no longer permitted to live at one's own rhythm, but must adjust to the rhythm of those dependent on one's decisions. The boy learned this lesson far earlier than most, before he had even found words for what he had surrendered. Yet within that surrender, another capacity began to form, the ability to endure ambiguity. When personal life ceased to be the center, one was forced to find another center. For him, that center gradually shifted inward, not toward ambition, but toward a question that returned again and again. How does one avoid losing oneself when everything outside no longer belongs to oneself? The adoption did not make him cold. On the contrary, it made him observe human beings more carefully. He came to see that behind every political decision were people who would be affected. Behind every form of stability were individuals who had sacrificed portions of their private lives. This awareness was not written into law. It remained in the mind like a quiet sediment. At night, in those rare moments when he was alone, he may have begun to understand that destiny, once bound to power, was no longer something to be dreamed about. It was a tool that had to be used with care, and the one who wielded it would have to be willing to be worn down in a similar way. The adoption closed childhood in the conventional sense, but it opened another journey, the journey of learning to see power not as a reward, but as a structure to be understood. To do so, he would need more than truthfulness and responsibility. He would need training to see through symbols, to understand the weight of words, and to distinguish between the appearance of power and its essence. And for that reason, in the next part, the story will lead us into a special education, not designed to produce a brilliant ruler, but to form a person capable of seeing through the purple robe, and of understanding that all power, if not governed by intelligence and self-mastery, can become a burden both to the one who holds it and to those affected by it. After the adoption, the boy's life was no longer guided by spontaneous choices, but by a carefully designed program, not to produce an exceptional individual in the conventional sense, but to shape someone who could stand within power without being consumed by it. This education did not begin with weapons or laws. It started with learning how to see. The teachers who appeared were different in temperament, yet they shared a quiet purpose: to teach him to see through the purple robe. In Rome, purple was the symbol of supremacy, of the right to command, of inviolability. But he was taught that behind that color were always concrete human beings, with fears, ambitions, and blind spots, not easily perceived. Without seeing this, a ruler would become a servant to the very symbol he wore. His education was not meant to stuff him with knowledge, but to recalibrate his reflexes. He learned to distinguish words that carry weight from words that merely create noise. He knew that a sentence, spoken at the right moment, could hold order together, while one spoken in the wrong place could unsettle an entire system. In the court, language was never neutral. It was a tool, and every tool requires ethical restraint. He was introduced to philosophy, rhetoric, history, and law. Yet more important was how these disciplines were placed beside one another. Philosophy did not stand apart as an idealized world. It was used to illuminate very real situations: when to remain silent, when to speak, when to preserve order, when to allow change, and most importantly, when to restrain oneself. One of the most challenging lessons was learning not to be seduced by the power of speech. Rhetoric could make crowds believe, but it could also make the speaker believe too much in himself. He was taught that the greater the influence of one's words, the more carefully one must examine one's inner motives. For the moment, a person begins to speak in order to hear their own voice echo, and power has already started to slip from their grasp. In long sessions of study, amid ancient texts and hypothetical debates, he gradually understood that power does not reside in moments of acclaim. It resides in small, repeated decisions that few notice. How one handles disagreement, how one responds to being challenged, how one uses language when there is no need to persuade anyone at all. These, rather than rituals, are what shape the nature of power. For those who have lived through many years, this lesson may sound familiar. The longer one lives, the clearer it becomes that the greatest danger is not power in the hands of others, but power that goes unrecognized within oneself. In this way, his education prepared him for something rare, the capacity to doubt oneself before doubting the world. He also learned to perceive the cost of power, not through heroic tales, but through quiet consequences. A decision made in a closed room could alter the lives of thousands whose names would never be recorded. Understanding this made him more cautious, slower, and less carried away by the exhilaration of authority. In an empire accustomed to glorifying speed and conquest, such deliberateness was a rare quality. This education did not produce a ruler confident in the usual sense. It made a person deeply aware of his own limits, and that awareness became another form of strength, the strength of not needing constant validation. When one does not have to continually assert oneself, energy can be devoted to observing, listening, and adjusting. Gradually, he came to understand that power is not something to be possessed, but something to be regulated. It is like a strong current. If one tries to grasp it, it will sweep one away. If one learns to guide it, it can nourish an entire land. The art of seeing through power, therefore, is not the rejection of power, but the refusal to let it cloud judgment. When the initial stages of this education were complete, he did not become detached from the world. On the contrary, he grew more attuned to reality, a reality that was complex, full of tension, and rarely willing to offer simple answers. Yet to live within such a reality, knowledge and discipline alone were not enough. He required a firmer inner pillar, a method for facing upheaval without losing composure, and it is precisely there, in the next part of the story, that another teacher will appear, not to teach him how to govern others, but to teach him something far more difficult, how to govern his own reactions. A path leading into Stoicism, where power is no longer measured by commands, but by the capacity to preserve virtue amid inevitable change. When his education in power had taught him how to see through symbols, one quiet question still remained unanswered. How does one preserve composure when the world continually tests our reactions? Knowledge can point the way. Discipline can create structure, but amid real upheavals, criticism, failure, loss, human beings require another anchor, deeper still, and that anchor came through Rusticus. Rusticus did not appear as a dazzling master. He offered no promises of brilliant wisdom, nor did he tell stories meant to inspire admiration. He arrived with a quiet, almost austere presence, carrying a simple reminder that is difficult to practice. Begin with what lies within your own control. Not the world, not other people, but your response to whatever occurs. The Stoic path that Rusticus opened was not a path of emotional avoidance. It was a path of placing emotions in their proper position. Emotions are not denied, but neither are they granted command. Between stimulus and response, there is always a small space. And within that space, a person can choose. Choose how to understand. Choose how to act. Choose to preserve dignity, even when circumstances offer no ease. For the boy, this lesson arrived as a quiet liberation. From very early on, he had lived within structures he did not choose. Major decisions were made outside his private life. Stoicism did not promise to restore complete freedom. It offered something more realistic, inner self-mastery. When the world cannot be adjusted to one's will, one can still change how one stands within it. Rusticus emphasized virtues that were not showy: justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom, not as ideals to be displayed, but as habits to be practiced daily. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear lead. Justice was not winning an argument, but not betraying what is right when no one is watching. Temperance was not the rejection of all pleasure, but the refusal to let pleasure give orders. And wisdom, finally, was the ability to distinguish what can be changed from what must be accepted. To those who have lived through many years, these ideas may sound so familiar as to seem obvious, yet precisely because they are familiar, they are easily forgotten. Rusticus did not teach to impress. He repeated with short reminders. He repeated through the way he lived. He repeated until these ideas ceased to be philosophy and became reflex. And once they became reflexes, they could support a person through the most exhausting moments. Stoicism also taught a complicated but necessary truth. Life does not owe us comfort. It owes us only the opportunity to act rightly. When expectations are reset in this way, disappointment lessens, not because circumstances improve, but because the standard of judgment has changed. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" one learns to ask, "In this situation, who should I be?" Under Rusticus's guidance, the boy gradually, understood that philosophy is not meant to win debates, but to survive with one's character intact. It is like a solid frame, invisible from the outside, yet capable of keeping the entire structure from collapsing under strong winds. And precisely because it is not ostentatious, it is well suited to someone who will have to bear great upheavals without being permitted to collapse in public. These teachings did not turn him into a person detached from feeling. On the contrary, they made him more sensitive to the suffering of others. For when one is not swept away by one's own reactions, one can see the person before them more clearly. Stoicism, in this sense, does not dry up compassion. It merely prevents emotion from becoming chaos. Gradually, he began to record these self-reminders, not to display knowledge, but to maintain balance. They were like small markers placed along a long road, reminding him that no matter how the world changed, there remained an inner axis that did not need to shift. This would become the foundation of the notes he would later write, lines meant for no one other than himself. Once the Stoic path was firmly laid, he did not become immune to pressure, but he learned how not to react hastily to it. And in a life soon to move into the very center of power, that capacity was more valuable than any weapon. For power does not only test intelligence, it tests reflexes every day, in every small matter, through every mistake that cannot be repeated. Yet the Stoic path, however solid, could not shield a person from another reality of power, isolation. As responsibility increases, distance from one's private world grows as well. And in the next part of the story, as the boy steps more fully into his assigned role, power will begin to take away something deeply human, the right to err in silence. That will be the moment when the gilded cage closes, and the lesson of inner freedom faces a far more difficult trial. There comes a moment, not recorded in chronicles, bearing no precise date, yet marking a decisive boundary in the boy's life. It is the moment he realizes that he has entered a new space, one where every gesture is watched, every word remembered, and every mistake, however small, no longer belongs to him alone. The gilded cage closes in this way, without the sound of a lock, without the shape of a prison. It is bright, spacious and adorned with praise. From the outside, such a life appears enviable. Imperial garments, formal rituals, a marriage carefully arranged to reinforce order, banquets where everyone smiles at the proper moment. But from within, he begins to sense a subtle shift. The right to err, the most ordinary right of a human being, is gradually disappearing. When an ordinary person makes a mistake, they can retreat, correct it, and continue living. When someone prepared for power errs, the mistake ceases to be personal. It becomes a sign, a precedent, even a warning. A slight misstep can be magnified into a moral issue. A moment of hesitation can be read as weakness, and in a world where power is always intent on protecting itself, tolerance for error grows scarce. He learns to move more slowly, not out of fear, but out of an understanding of the weight carried by each step. He learns to consider his words before speaking, not to conceal truth, but to avoid unnecessary consequences. From a distance, such caution may appear cold. In reality, it is a form of preserving one's character. The gilded cage also brings another exchange. Private life becomes the property of the public. There are no longer moments entirely one's own. Every emotional expression can be interpreted. Every relationship can be questioned. Even silence becomes a message others attempt to decode. To live within this cage demands a rare capacity, the ability to keep one's inner life from being unsettled by the constant gaze from outside. For those who have lived through many years, this recalls a familiar truth. The greater the responsibility, the smaller the space for impulsiveness. Youth allows trial and error. Responsibility compels choice and endurance. The boy enters this phase far earlier than most, as personal choices dissolve into the expectations of the system. On some nights, in rare moments of quiet, he may have asked himself, "Whose life am I living?" That question does not lead to rebellion. It leads to a subtle adjustment. If the role cannot be changed, then one must change how one stands within it. Stoicism, with its lessons on governing reactions, begins to prove its worth, not in grand crises, but in the smallest frictions of daily life. The Gilded Cage also teaches a harsh lesson. Mistakes made within power are often written in blood, not always blood in the literal sense, but always in real loss. A poorly considered decision can exact a price from others. A concession made at the wrong moment can unsettle order. Understanding this makes him more demanding of himself and more cautious about what he does not yet understand. Yet the cage does not only take away, it also refines. When the right to err is gone, one is compelled to prepare more carefully, listen more attentively, and examine oneself before acting. This is not the path of comfort, but the path of accelerated maturity. Each day within the cage becomes a day of training in bearing consequences. What matters is this: he does not allow the cage to turn him into a bitter skeptic. He understands that systems do not exist to torment individuals, but to prevent chaos. And when one stands in a position designed for the future of an entire empire, personal freedom cannot be the highest priority. This awareness does not erase the sense of loss, but it grants that loss meaning. For older listeners, this is a deeply resonant point. As life advances, choices become less experimental and more binding. One no longer asks, "What do I want?" but rather, "What am I responsible for?" And within that shift, the quality of a person gradually reveals itself. The Gilded Cage, therefore, is not merely a symbol of confinement. It is the ultimate testing ground of inner freedom. Inside, no one can rescue him from pressure except himself. What he learned from his grandfather, from Veracious, from Rusticus, now ceases to be knowledge and becomes a means of survival. As time passes, he grows accustomed to a life under observation, not by numbing emotion, but by placing emotion where it belongs. And it is precisely this adaptation that prepares him for the next stage, a stage in which he no longer merely learns to endure power, but begins to practice power in silence, under the guidance of another teacher, a ruler whose greatness did not arise from conquest, but from enduring stability. In the next part, the story enters a long and quiet apprenticeship, where power is observed as a craft, and patience becomes the most critical lesson before the supreme door finally opens. After the gilded cage had closed, after the right to air had narrowed to the point of near disappearance, his life entered another phase, one neither glamorous nor dramatic, yet long and decisive. 23 years, a span long enough for a person to fully mature, long enough for every illusion about power to fall away if one is willing to observe. This was the period of apprenticeship beside Antoninus Pius, a ruler rarely remembered for military exploits, yet recalled for prolonged stability. There were no dazzling campaigns to inscribe in the chronicles, no reforms that shook the world, only an order maintained day after day, like the steady breathing of a body that had no desire to draw attention to itself. And it was precisely within that steadiness that he learned a profound lesson. The best form of power is the kind that makes people forget it is there at all. Apprenticeship here did not mean waiting for an empty throne. It meant participation in the most minor details of governing, listening to lengthy legal cases, observing how the law was applied, not according to emotion, but according to principle, watching decisions that seemed mundane, a tax adjustment, a local appointment, an administrative ruling, yet carried lasting consequences for the lives of thousands. Antoninus did not teach through grand advice. He taught through rhythm, beginning each workday on time, seeing every matter through to its conclusion. No display, no haste. For a young man long prepared for significant roles, this posed a different challenge, learning patience with the ordinary. Power in this phase did not take the form of commands. It took the form of repeated responsibility, a day after day. There were no climaxes to release emotion, no victories to reinforce the ego, only work, quiet, continuous, and demanding sustained attention. This is where many fail, not because they lack ability, but because they cannot endure the absence of glory. For those who have lived long lives, this lesson feels familiar. Most of life is not shaped by extraordinary moments, but by how we handle small tasks when no one applauds. Governing, seen this way, is not so different from caring for a family or sustaining a community. It requires consistency more than inspiration, responsibility more than bursts of enthusiasm. During those 23 years, he also lived through a complex family life. 13 children, many born, many lost. Joy scarcely had time to take root before sorrow arrived. These repeated losses were not allowed to interrupt the work, yet they quietly trained him in another way, to become acquainted with impermanence without numbing the heart. Each time he buried a young life, he learned something no book could teach. Not every effort leads to the desired outcome, and that does not render the effort meaningless. This acceptance did not make him pessimistic. It made him realistic. And in governance, realism is a saving virtue. The long apprenticeship also revealed a common illusion about power, that those at the top can control everything. The truth was the opposite. The closer he stood to the center, the more clearly he saw the limits of control. Plague, weather, human temperament, upheavals beyond the borders, all lay outside any plan. The only thing that could be controlled was how one responds when plans fail. Antoninus, through his composure, showed him that leadership is not about predicting everything correctly, but about preventing the system from collapsing when predictions prove wrong. This was the art of stability, an art that draws little attention, yet preserves an entire era. Gradually, he learned not to seek personal imprint in every decision. Not everything needed to bear the name of its maker. Some things were best completed and then absorbed into the standard order. When the ego ceased to be the center, energy was released for what mattered more, keeping other people's lives running smoothly. 23 years passed without producing a single dazzling milestone to recount, yet they forged a person entirely different from the boy who had once entered the gilded cage. A person accustomed to doing what was right in silence, accustomed to going unpraised, accustomed to carrying responsibility without needing to prove worth. And precisely because he had grown accustomed to this, when the unavoidable moment approached, when the throne no longer had a holder, he did not step forward with the eagerness of one who had waited too long. He stepped forward with the clarity of someone who had seen enough, understood enough, and knew that power is not a reward for patience, but the final test of character. In the next part, we will witness that moment arrive, the moment when the quiet apprenticeship ends and power is formally bestowed, not upon a perfect man, but upon one who has been trained long enough to understand the limits of himself. There are periods in life when a person needs neither more advice nor more knowledge. What they need is a place to stand so as not to fall, a slender railing to lean on when inner strength begins to fracture. For him, after 23 years of quiet apprenticeship, that railing appeared in a form so simple it could easily be overlooked. Lines written for himself, not a diary in the usual sense, no recounting of how the day unfolded, no recording of achievements or complaints, only brief scattered notes, like small stones placed along a slippery path, writing not to preserve, but to adjust, writing to remind himself to return to the proper position whenever the mind began to drift too far. He wrote, at moments few noticed when the room had fallen silent, when footsteps in the corridor grew sparse, when the responsibilities of the day had not yet dissolved, but endurance had begun to wear thin. He did not write to vent emotion, but to place emotion on the table, look directly at it, and then arrange it. At that age, many people turn outward for counsel. He turned inward, not out of withdrawal, but out of an efficient understanding. No one inhabits our mind except ourselves. When pressure cannot be shared, one must learn to converse with oneself or be worn down by ungoverned thoughts. The lines he wrote were not ornate. They resembled gentle commands, firm yet quiet. Remember what lies within your control. Accept what does not. Behave with kindness, even when it is not returned. Prepare to be misunderstood. Do what is right, even when no one notices. Each sentence served as an anchor, keeping the inner vessel from drifting amid the undercurrents of expectation and doubt. For those who have lived many years, this is familiar. At some point, one realizes that what exhausts a person most is not work itself, but the noise within. Questions that repeat, anxieties without answers, visions of the future that exceed one's ability to foresee. Writing, in such moments, is not literature. It is a tool of mental survival. He did not write to prove himself right. He wrote to detect the moment when he began to deceive himself. Those who dwell near power for too long can easily come to believe that their own thoughts outweigh reality. These notes functioned as an unflattering mirror. Whenever the ego began to swell, the written word drew it back to a tolerable size. The private journal also allowed him to do something rare, to fail in silence. There were days when decisions produced no desired outcome, days when effort yielded no visible change. Before the public, he could not reveal hesitation, but on the page, he could admit, "Today, I reacted poorly. Today, I allowed fatigue to lead. Today, I must do better." Such admissions, unjudged, became resources for correcting tomorrow. Writing also helped him distinguish what mattered from what merely clamored for attention. In the court, information arrived incessantly. Opinions overlapped. Every matter demanded notice. The page allowed him to step back, place everything on a single plane, and choose what to retain and what to discard. Not by impulse, but by principles repeated until they became habit. One detail is especially striking. These notes were never directed outward. No appeals, no manifestos, no expectation of readers. It was precisely this absolute privacy that made them effective. When no applause is sought, one is more likely to speak truthfully to oneself. And speaking truthfully to oneself, as he had learned early on, is the condition for not being distorted by power. For listeners seeking a slower rhythm, the lesson here lies not in the specific content of the lines, but in the habit of self-examination. Each evening before sleep, one might ask, how did I respond today to what I did not wish for? Where did I preserve dignity, and where did I lose it? The answers need not be perfect. They need only be honest enough to prevent the same deviation tomorrow. The private journal did not render him invulnerable. It simply helped him avoid collapse under accumulated pressure. And in a life preparing to move into the center of supreme power, that was more valuable than any other skill. For power does not destroy a person with a single blow. It erodes through repetition, prolonged fatigue, and the sensation of having to be right under an unceasing gaze. Those pages would later be known by many names, but at this moment, they were simply a place to stand, a small, quiet space where a person could gather scattered fragments of himself, align them, and continue forward without losing direction. As the act of writing became more regular, he gradually realized something else. Self-control is not only a defense, but preparation. Preparation for the moment when power would no longer be nearby to observe, but would rest fully in his hands. And when that moment arrived, as the next part of the story will show, he would be forced to make a first decision, not to display strength but to apply the brakes to himself, so that power, from the very beginning, would not be allowed to run too fast. The transfer of power is never as loud as people imagine. It does not arrive with cheers, but with a dense silence. When the one at the top departs, the room remains. The people still stand in their places, yet gravity has shifted. From that moment on, every gaze waits for a reaction, and that first reaction reveals how deeply the one who has stepped forward understands power. He does not rush, he does not declare, he does not display. Before saying anything to the world, he returns to an old habit: self-examination. The private pages have taught him a fundamental truth. Power, once entirely entrusted, has a tendency to persuade its holder that he has become the center of all judgment. This illusion does not arise from corrupt ambition. It arises from the dangerous quiet surrounding the throne. When there is no one above you, it becomes easy to confuse responsibility with omnipotence. And so the first act is not meant to demonstrate strength, but to apply the brakes. He chooses to share power, not as a gesture of weakness, but as a structure of self-protection. To share is to avoid isolation. To share is to prevent hearing only one voice, the echo of one's own, for too long. To many, this decision is perplexing. Power has just arrived. Why not grip it tightly? But to him, power is a powerful current. If forced into a single channel, it will carve the riverbed deeper and erode both banks. Sharing power is a way of guiding the flow, allowing strength to pass through multiple channels, reducing destructive force while increasing regulation. This is not a lack of confidence, but self-knowledge. The act is also a rare admission. The empire is too large for a single ego. No one, no matter how disciplined, can process every fluctuation at once without succumbing to cognitive fatigue. When fatigue accumulates, reactions grow blunt, and decisions are easily overtaken by emotion. Sharing power disperses the burden, allowing each decision to be examined from multiple angles before it becomes a consequence for millions. For listeners who have lived many years, this lesson feels close. At a particular stage of life, one understands that working alone is not always a sign of competence. It is sometimes a sign of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of sharing responsibility, fear of having one's limits exposed. To share, by contrast, is to trust that order does not depend on a single individual. To share is to place the system above the self. The decision carries an even subtler meaning. It creates a safe distance from flattery. When power concentrates, praise tends to grow faster than warning. The person at the center gradually hears only what is pleasant. Sharing power opens additional channels of feedback, allowing truth to reach the center without being distorted too early. For someone who has trained honesty as a discipline, this becomes the condition for remaining honest when circumstances no longer favor it. Not everyone is pleased. Sharing power does not eliminate conflict. It merely brings conflict into the open sooner. He accepts this. For conflict that is spoken can still be addressed. Conflict that is suppressed eventually erupts. Above all, he understands that power unchecked by structure will seek to control people. Today, it controls others. Tomorrow, it controls the one who holds it. That first act also sends a message into the future. If one day he is wrong, this structure allows correction. There is no need to wait for tragedy. No need to pay in a catastrophic collapse. Sharing power is an investment in the capacity to correct error. And in governance, the ability to fix is more valuable than the illusion of never being wrong. Internally, the decision produces another effect: relief. Not because responsibility diminishes, but because responsibility is placed where it belongs. Knowing he is not the sole pillar, a person can breathe more evenly, listen more fully, and act more slowly. That slowness is not delay. It is a buffer that allows wisdom to catch up with power. For those listening in a state of fatigue, this lesson can be brought very close to home. In family life, in work, in small communities, sharing responsibility does not weaken us. It strengthens endurance. When we are no longer straining to do everything alone, we preserve a kinder voice, a fairer gaze, and the ability to correct ourselves before correcting others. The first act has been set down like a foundation stone. It causes no shock, yet it establishes the correct incline for everything that follows. From here on, power is no longer a solid block, but a structure with joints. And when a structure has joints, it can withstand tremors without breaking. But sharing power does not exempt a person from the world's consequences. External upheavals are already approaching. War, plague, and decisions that cannot be postponed will soon test the structure just erected. In the next part of the story, shared power will face its first reality, a victory that carries a shadow and a cost no one wishes to pay. War is often recounted through redrawn borders, captured cities, and triumphal songs echoing across public squares. But for those who stand at the center of power, war rarely begins as glory. It starts as an uncomfortable necessity, a disruption that, if left unaddressed, could cause order to collapse in an even worse way. The war with Parthia arrived in just this manner. No one at court desired it, yet signals of instability from the east, challenges to the empire's authority, forced the newly shared power to confront its first concrete reality. And so, the war was entrusted to the co-emperor, a decision that made sense on paper, a test of the newly designed structure of power. He remained behind, maintaining stability at the center, while the campaign unfolded far away. Victory, when it came, arrived more quickly than expected. Armies returned with favorable reports. Borders were secured. Honor was restored. For many, the story could have ended there. A successful war, a correct decision, proof of the effectiveness of shared power. But for one accustomed to looking beneath the surface, the victory carried with it a strange sensation, the sense that something did not belong in the reports of triumph. For victory never returns alone. Alongside the returning legions came exhausted soldiers, weakened bodies, and something invisible moving quietly among them. No drums, no banners, only fevers, scattered deaths, and houses that suddenly closed their doors in silence. A plague began to seep into the empire, slowly, persistently, like a shadow stretching behind the light of victory. This was the cost that war rarely includes in its calculations. Supplies are counted, troops are tallied, treasuries are measured. But few account for the biological consequences of moving tens of thousands of people across distant lands. And when those consequences emerged, they could not be assigned to a single fault. They were the outcome of an entire system, functioning exactly according to its own logic. For him, this became a painful but necessary lesson. Victory does not mark the end of responsibility. On the contrary, it often opens a new chain of responsibility, quieter and far more challenging to manage. There is no clear enemy to confront, no battle to regain initiative, only spreading consequences, extending far beyond the original intention of any decision. In the early days of the plague, silence spread faster than information. People did not know what to fear. Rumors filled the void left by understanding, and within that void, power was tested in a different way, not by military strength, but by the ability to keep an entire frightened society calm. Seen from this vantage, the Parthian War was no longer a story of territory. It became a living illustration of a paradox of power. Some decisions are justified, executed successfully, and yet still leave behind consequences no one desires. And the one ultimately responsible is not the victor on the battlefield, but the one who remains to manage the aftermath. For those who have lived many years, this lesson is familiar. Not every correct decision leads to a comfortable outcome. Some necessary choices carry a long-lasting cost. Maturity lies not in avoiding such decisions, but in the capacity not to turn away from their consequences. He did not deny the victory, but neither did he allow it to obscure the reality unfolding in streets, homes, and distant provinces. In his mind, war and plague began to overlap as two sides of the same challenge: how to lead when familiar tools, Commands, laws, armies are no longer sufficient to address fear. The Parthian victory thus became a warning. It reminded him that power, no matter how carefully shared or controlled, cannot eliminate risk. The only thing it can do is reduce destruction through a timely response. And a timely response, in this case, did not mean celebration, but preparation for a far more difficult period ahead. As the plague spread, new questions arose. How long would the treasury endure? Who would care for the sick? Who would step forward to reassure the population when fear traveled faster than disease itself? These questions had no simple answers. They demanded a different kind of leadership, one not grounded in military prestige, but in presence and the sharing of burden. The war had ended on the map, but in human life, the aftermath had only just begun. And it was precisely in this transitional moment that he understood the greatest trials of power do not come from external enemies, but from internal consequences for which no one else can be blamed. In the next part of the story, the shadow of victory will take on clearer form. The plague will cease to be a rumor and become a reality, covering the entire empire. And at the center of that stench of death, power will be forced to choose a different mode of leadership, not through swords, but through presence, sacrifice, and a new definition of public responsibility. There are moments in history when power is not measured by commands, nor by victories. It is calculated by presence. The Antonine plague spread across the empire like a heavy mist, colorless, soundless, yet seeping into every street, every household, every breath. The stench of death did not erupt. It accumulated, and it was this accumulation that became the hardest trial for those at the top. Rome, long accustomed to its restless rhythm, suddenly slowed. Doors closed more often. Footsteps grew hurried. Rumors moved faster than the truth. People did not know which fear to face first, the invisible disease or the loneliness that followed when familiar connections were severed. In such days, power often turns to symbols for reassurance, rituals, proclamations, promises. But symbols stand only when supported by quiet action beneath them. He chose to remain, not to stay in the sense of clinging to the throne, but to remain within a life whose rhythm was breaking apart. Hospitals were expanded. Resources were redirected. Decisions were made that did not perform well on a stage, yet took immediate effect for the most vulnerable. When the treasury tightened, he sold personal assets, not to display virtue, but to sustain the flow of care, the only thing capable of preventing fear from turning into panic. Leadership during a plague allows no illusion. There is no enemy to defeat, no victory date to announce, only slowly rising numbers, names vanishing from civic registers, families learning to live with absence. In such circumstances, power is tested by a single question. Does it dare to admit its own limits? He did not promise the impossible. He did not pretend to control what lay beyond reach. He chose the more challenging path, keeping order from collapsing while accepting that loss was unavoidable. On some nights, the city fell so silent that the wind could be heard moving across rooftops. In that stillness, he understood that what people needed was not only measures but a shared rhythm of breathing. When the leader panics, fear multiplies. When the leader maintains composure, composure becomes a social sedative. Calm is not indifference. It is emotional discipline in the presence of grief. The plague also exposed an uncomfortable truth. The most vulnerable bore the heaviest blow. Cramped dwellings, crowded quarters, those without the option to withdraw. Faced with this reality, He placed public welfare above imperial splendor, not from abstract idealism, but from a practical logic. If the weakest segment breaks, the entire structure follows. Governing during a plague is the art of reinforcing what is most likely to crack. For those who have lived into old age, memories of past epidemics often carry a quiet lesson. Life is more fragile than any plan. The Antonine plague reiterated that lesson on the scale of an empire, and in that reminder, he did not seek to dress suffering in meaning. He simply did what needed to be done, repeated each day, until the rhythm of life could stand again. That a repetition, steady, uncelebrated, is a form of heroism rarely recorded. Amid the stench of death, philosophy ceased to be theory. It became a method of endurance. Familiar self-reminders returned. Focus on what lies within reach. Act with kindness. Do not let fear give orders. When fate knocked on every door, preserving humanity in small interactions, how one spoke, how one listened, how resources were allocated, became the accurate moral measure. Not everyone noticed, but those who were helped remembered. As the plague dragged on, social patience wore thin. When exhaustion accumulates, people look for someone to blame. Rumors require a name. He did not feed anger to disguise helplessness. He chose transparency where possible and responsible silence where answers were not yet available. Transparency is not saying everything. It is not saying what one does not know. Silence is not evasion, it is restraint, so that words do not cause harm. Perhaps this was the moment when power was most clearly redefined. Not the power to make others afraid, but the power to prevent fear from governing the community. Not the power to command, but the power to distribute the burden fairly. When the leader accepts the sacrifice of his own comfort, society learns to sacrifice in an ordered way, rather than in panic. The Antonine plague did not disappear overnight. It withdrew slowly, leaving behind absences difficult to fill. Yet when the wave finally subsided, what remained was more than numbers. It was the memory of a kind of leadership that did not flee the stench of death, that did not avoid the tasks few wished to perform. That memory, lacking triumph, became moral capital for trials yet to come. For the plague was not the final ordeal. As society was still recovering, power would face another loss, one deeper still, where the sharing that once reduced illusion would now be tested by solitude. In the next part of the story, the death of the co-emperor will return power to a single center, and with it, return to the one who stands there the full responsibility of loneliness, odorless, soundless, yet no lighter than any plague. Death does not always arrive like a thunderbolt. At times, it comes as a quiet withdrawal, leaving behind a void whose depth is only felt once one steps into it. When the co-emperor passed away, power did not erupt. It contracted. Every line of responsibility drew inward toward a single point, like the last currents of water flowing into a deep, cold basin. Before this, power had been shared to prevent illusion. Two voices, two rhythms, two perspectives helped keep the center from becoming isolated. That sharing did not make things easier, but it created a buffer, a space where decisions could be examined from multiple sides, where silence was never long enough to harden into monologue. When that buffer disappeared, silence changed its nature. It grew heavier, it lingered longer, and it carried with it a responsibility that could no longer be transferred. The death of a companion was not only a personal loss, it marked the end of a structure. There were no longer face-to-face deliberations. no safe place for differing views to collide. Every question now turned in a single direction, and every answer, no matter how careful, bore the imprint of one mind alone. From this point forward, if a decision was right, it was his. If it was wrong, it was also his. There was no one left beside him to absorb the aftershocks. In the first days, the city continued to function. Schedules remained full, rituals were still performed, but inwardly, a shift had taken place. Power returning to Solitude did not make him stronger. It made him more acutely aware of limits. There was no one left to cast a shadow, no one to diffuse the force. Each decision now required an additional cycle of self-examination, because there was no longer a natural mechanism to perform that task for him. For those who have lived long lives, this moment feels familiar in another way. At some point, many realize that those who once helped distribute the weight have gradually departed. Children grow up, friends become fewer, roles accumulate. Life does not ask whether one is ready. It simply transfers responsibility into a single pair of hands. And in that transfer, the difficulty is not doing more, but enduring the loneliness of having to decide alone. He did not attempt to fill the void with noise. He did not multiply rituals to reassure. He did not erect new symbols to mask reality. Instead, he accepted solitude as part of the role. Solitude is not separation from humanity. It is the condition in which no one else can fully share the final burden. Understood this way, solitude does not need to be expelled. It needs to be managed. Managing solitude begins with acknowledging it, not deceiving oneself into believing one needs no one, not pretending that everything remains unchanged. In his habit of writing for himself, the lines on the page became even more necessary, not to complain, but to prevent the inner voice from becoming a monopoly. When power returns to one alone, the greatest danger is not error, but the absence of contradiction. Writing, at this point, becomes a way to construct a rigorous internal dialogue to partially replace the space that has been lost. Solitude also reveals another truth. The throne does not console. It does not listen. It only demands. With the loss of shared companionship, he understood that what remained was not privilege, but obligation in its purest form, undiluted, uncompensated, though such an obligation does not permit collapse. It permits only disciplined fatigue. In subsequent decisions, caution increased, not from fear, but from the understanding that mistakes now had no one with whom to be shared. This caution did not slow him down. It made him precise. Precise in choosing priorities. Precise in speaking less when the information was insufficient. Precise in listening to weaker voices, for when power concentrates, weaker voices are the first to be lost. The death of the co-emperor also closed a comforting illusion that power can always be shared. In truth, it cannot. There comes a moment when history compels one person to stand at the final point of responsibility. When that happens, what keeps a person from slipping is not ambition, but inner discipline long cultivated. Lessons about reaction, moderation, and justice now ceased to be philosophy. They became safety equipment. For older listeners, this part touches a quietly sorrowful truth. As roles increase, companionship diminishes. One can no longer share everything, not because of a lack of affection, but because not everyone can carry the final weight. Recognizing this does not impoverish life. It clarifies it. One knows where one stands and how one must hold oneself to avoid breaking. Power returning to solitude did not make him close off. It made him more humble before consequences. With no one left to share responsibility, every decision was weighed by its long-term impact, not merely by immediate effectiveness. This humility was not weakness. It was the understanding that the world is governed not by good intentions, but by real consequences. And then, as with every period of solitude in life, this solitude carried with it an inevitable movement, action. Not action to prove oneself, but action to confront what was approaching. When power concentrates, the world does not wait for the leader to settle emotionally. Disturbances along the northern frontier had already begun to stir. New threats did not allow for delay. In the next part of the story, solitude will no longer be merely a mental condition. It will become a condition on the ground. As the northern borders ignite and war sinks into mud, the one who leads will not only bear responsibility alone, but will also share risk with those he commands. This will be the moment when the philosopher must roll up his sleeves, and power must leave closed chambers to step into the mire, where every theory is tested by reality. Death does not always arrive like a thunderbolt. At times, it comes as a quiet withdrawal, leaving behind a void whose depth is only felt once one steps into it. When the co-emperors passed away, power did not erupt. It contracted. Every line of responsibility drew inward toward the single point, like the last currents of water flowing into a deep, cold basin. Before this, power had been shared to prevent illusion. Two voices, two rhythms, two perspectives helped keep the center from becoming isolated. That sharing did not make things easier, but it created a buffer, a space where decisions could be examined from multiple sides, where silence was never long enough to harden into monologue. When that buffer disappeared, silence changed its nature. It grew heavier, it lingered longer, and it carried with it a responsibility that could no longer be transferred. The death of a companion was not only a personal loss, it marked the end of a structure. There were no longer face-to-face deliberations, no safe place for differing views to collide. Every question now turned in a single direction, and every answer, no matter how careful, bore the imprint of one mind alone. From this point forward, if a decision was right, it was his. If it was wrong, it was also his. There was no one left beside him to absorb the aftershocks. In the first days, the city continued to function. Schedules remained full. Rituals were still performed. But inwardly, a shift had taken place. Power returning to solitude did not make him stronger. It made him more acutely aware of limits. There was no one left to cast a shadow, no one to diffuse the force. Each decision now required an additional cycle of self-examination, because there was no longer a natural mechanism to perform that task for him. For those who have lived long lives, this moment feels familiar in another way. At some point, many realize that those who once helped distribute the weight have gradually departed. Children grow up, friends become fewer, roles accumulate. Life does not ask whether one is ready. It simply transfers responsibility into a single pair of hands. And in that transfer, the difficulty is not doing more, but enduring the loneliness of having to decide alone. He did not attempt to fill the void with noise. He did not multiply rituals to reassure. He did not erect new symbols to mask reality. Instead, he accepted solitude as part of the role. Solitude is not separation from humanity. It is the condition in which no one else can fully share the final burden. Understood this way, solitude does not need to be expelled. It needs to be managed. Managing solitude begins with acknowledging it, not deceiving oneself into believing one needs no one. not pretending that everything remains unchanged. In his habit of writing for himself, the lines on the page became even more necessary, not to complain, but to prevent the inner voice from becoming a monopoly. When power returns to one alone, the greatest danger is not error, but the absence of contradiction. Writing, at this point, becomes a way to construct a rigorous internal dialogue to partially replace the space that has been lost. Solitude also reveals another truth. The throne does not console. It does not listen. It only demands. With the loss of shared companionship, he understood that what remained was not privilege, but obligation in its purest form, undiluted, uncompensated. Such an obligation does not permit collapse. It permits only disciplined fatigue. In subsequent decisions, caution increased, not from fear, but from the understanding that mistakes now had no one with whom to be shared. This caution did not slow him down. It made him precise. Precise in choosing priorities. Precise in speaking less when the information was insufficient. Precise in listening to weaker voices. For when power concentrates, weaker voices are the first to be lost. The death of the co-emperor also closed a comforting illusion that power can always be shared. In truth, it cannot. There comes a moment when history compels one person to stand at the final point of responsibility. When that happens, what keeps a person from slipping is not ambition, but inner discipline long cultivated. Lessons about reaction, moderation, and justice now ceased to be philosophy. They became safety equipment. For older listeners, this part touches a quietly sorrowful truth. As roles increase, companionship diminishes. One can no longer share everything, not because of a lack of affection, but because not everyone can carry the final weight. Recognizing this does not impoverish life. It clarifies it. One knows where one stands and how one must hold oneself to avoid breaking. Power returning to solitude did not make him close off. It made him more humble before consequences. With no one left to share responsibility, every decision was weighed by its long-term impact, not merely by immediate effectiveness. This humility was not weakness. It was the understanding that the world is governed not by good intentions, but by real consequences. And then, as with every period of solitude in life, this solitude carried with it an inevitable movement, action. Not action to prove oneself, but action to confront what was approaching. When power concentrates, the world does not wait for the leader to settle emotionally. Disturbances along the northern frontier had already begun to stir. New threats did not allow for delay. In the next part of the story, solitude will no longer be merely a mental condition. It will become a condition on the ground. As the northern borders ignite and war sinks into mud, the one who leads will not only bear responsibility alone, but will also share risk with those he commands. This will be the moment when the philosopher must roll up his sleeves and power must leave closed chambers to step into the mire, where every theory is tested by reality. Failure does not arrive with a loud explosion. It comes through minor signs that were overlooked, assumptions that once seemed reasonable, and a moment that, in hindsight, everyone wishes had been met with a little more slowness. On the Danube front, amid bone-deep cold and fatigue accumulated over many sleepless nights, the first defeat unfolded in precisely this way, without drama, without tragedy, yet deep enough to force the one in command to face a difficult question. Once we have erred, what do we do next? Not all failures are alike. Some are born of recklessness, others of hesitation. Here, failure arose from a lack of field experience in conditions to which philosophy had not yet adapted. Complex terrain, unpredictable weather, and fragmented intelligence all converged to turn a plan that made sense on paper into a poor outcome in reality. When the consequences appeared, there was no room for prolonged blame. Soldiers needed new guidance, defensive lines required adjustment, and time, the least forgiving element in war, allowed no space for lamentation. What mattered was not the defeat itself, but the response to defeat. In many cases, power reacts by tightening control, seeking a scapegoat, or covering the truth with reassuring language. He did none of this. He chose a more challenging path, naming the failure for what it was, and then opening the door to learning. Not closed meetings to preserve appearances, but direct dialogue with those who knew the mud best, the officers who had been on the front line when things slipped beyond expectation. There, an old lesson was relearned in a new form. Competence is not innate. It is a discipline of learning under adverse conditions. Learning from failure requires a different kind of courage than charging forward. It is the courage to face one's limits under the gaze of those who depend on you. When a leader dares to ask, rather than merely command, the atmosphere shifts. Silence lightens. Crucial details emerge. And knowledge, scattered across many lived experiences, is gathered into workable solutions. The first defeat also taught a subtle lesson: the timing of decisions. In closed chambers, optimization is achieved through reasoning. On the ground, it is achieved through rhythm. At times, one must slow down to protect supply lines. At others, narrow objectives to preserve strength. At still others, accept imperfection to maintain order. These lessons are not learned from books, but by paying just enough of a price to retain the chance to correct course. And that chance exists only when a leader does not imprison himself within self-defense. For those who have lived long lives, this experience feels familiar in another way. Failure in life is rarely a single collapse. It is an accumulation of small misalignments. The art of learning from failure lies not in reversing time, but in adjusting tempo, slowing slightly where slowness is needed, quickening where speed is required, and, above all, refusing to let the ego dictate pace. At the Danube, this art was practiced through concrete changes. Plans were broken into smaller parts. Objectives were redefined. Responsibilities were clarified to prevent information bottlenecks. Discipline was reinforced not through punishment, but through consistency. When rewards and consequences are applied evenly, trust returns. And when trust returns, it works more effectively than commands. With trust at work, organizations learn faster than individuals ever could. Failure also revealed another truth: cognitive fatigue. After many sleepless nights, decisions gravitate toward familiar paths. Recognizing this, he deliberately created measured intervals of rest, not to evade responsibility, but to preserve judgment. This is a rarely spoken lesson in leadership. When the mind is exhausted, ethics grow fragile. Keeping the mind sufficiently clear is a moral obligation, not merely a matter of health. During the few quiet nights that followed, the habit of writing returned with a different purpose, not merely to steady himself, but to distill lessons, writing briefly, writing precisely, recording what went wrong, what was learned, and what must not be repeated. These lines were not meant to soften pain, but to transform pain into data. When failure is converted into data, it loses its power to paralyze. There is a quiet paradox in this moment. Failure makes power more precise. There is no display, no excess language. Everything returns to essentials: people, Terrain, time. As precision increases, philosophy does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes the ability to choose what matters amid chaos. It becomes the discipline of saying, "not yet" when needed, and "enough" when enough has been reached. For older listeners, the lesson here does not encourage recklessness, but disciplined flexibility. Failure, when learned adequately from, does not diminish a person. It makes one better fitted to reality, fitted not to demand too much of the world, and not to lower one's own standards. As adjustments began to take effect, the atmosphere in the camp shifted, not because victory arrived at once, but because the path forward became clearer, clear in knowing what was being done, why it was being done, and where to stop if conditions changed. Clarity, in war as in life, is a rare form of comfort. The first defeat, therefore, did not close the story. It opened a skill. The skill of rising correctly, the skill of asking the right people, the skill of correcting the right places, and the most critical skill of all, refusing to let a single mistake define the whole person. Once this skill is formed, subsequent trials cease to be blind tests. They become exercises that can be approached with intent. In the next part of the story, as the long season of warfare forces the philosopher to continue living in the mud, the lessons just learned will be distilled into shorter, steadier, deeper lines, lines written for himself in the tent, where ink freezes from the cold. There, the governance of the state will rejoin the governance of the mind, and self-observation will emerge as a mental technology that keeps one from losing direction amid inevitable upheaval. Amid the camp on the banks of the Danube, when nights grew longer than days, and the cold caused ink to freeze inside its jar, there was a task absent from every official order, yet repeated with patient persistence: writing to oneself. Not to tell stories, not to record achievements, not to construct a finished system, only short, separate lines, steady in rhythm, like careful footsteps through mud. Each step firm enough not to slip, humble enough not to rush. These reflections were not born in a quiet study. They were distilled from fatigue, from a recent defeat, from decisions made with incomplete information. Mud allows no ornate language. It forces philosophy to speak briefly and accurately. As the cold tightens its grip, words tighten as well, shedding everything superfluous. What remains are simple propositions. Focus on what lies within reach. Accept what does not. Preserve dignity in every reaction. Do not let exhaustion decide morality. Writing, in this context, is not a retreat from reality, but a way to anchor oneself in it. Between stimulus and response, the lines create a thin buffer, just enough to allow choice. The choice not to speak when speech is unnecessary, not to act when irritation is leading the way, not to promise what cannot be kept. These small choices, repeated, keep a person from being swept away by the accelerated tempo of war. One thing matters greatly. These reflections do not face outward. They do not persuade. They do not instruct. They do not seek agreement. They exist as a private dialogue, where there is no audience to please. Precisely because there is no audience, honesty can endure. When no recognition is required, a person finds it easier to speak truthfully to himself. And speaking truthfully to oneself, as he learned early on, is the condition for not deceiving oneself when power draws near. In the mud, philosophy becomes a mental technology, not to embellish ideas, but to operate the mind under adverse conditions. Like a craftsman learning to keep balance on a slick surface, a leader learns to maintain balance amid chaos. Short reminders are repeated until they become reflexes. Those reflexes ensure that tomorrow's decisions are not poisoned by today's disappointment. For those who have lived many years, this feels familiar. At some point, one understands that advice does not save us on difficult nights. Habits do. The habit of returning to a small set of firm principles. The habit of recalibrating expectations to match reality. The habit of accepting that some days one can only choose the lesser harm, and that, at times, is enough. These reflections addressed to oneself also help redefine success. No longer quick victory or immediate recognition, but the ability to keep the rhythm. Rhythm in work, rhythm in conduct, rhythm in correction. When rhythm is maintained, great upheavals no longer knock a person off his axis. That axis, justice, moderation, courage, wisdom, is not a slogan. It is a daily checklist. Writing in the mud is also a way to detoxify language. In war, words tend to swell to conceal fatigue. Private pages return language to its accurate scale. Fewer promises, no exaggeration, only reminders of what must be remembered. When language does not swell, decisions do not swell either. And when decisions do not fail, consequences are less destructive. On some nights, doubt creeps in like mist. Doubt about choices, doubt about capability, doubt about the meaning of sacrifice. The lines, "to myself," do not banish doubt with hollow optimism. They place doubt where it belongs, as a signal to re-examine assumptions, not as a verdict. When doubt is used correctly, it sharpens decisions. When suppressed, it hardens them. Here, an apparent paradox emerges. Self-observation does not weaken a person. It makes one more resilient. When we can see ourselves, we feel less need to prove ourselves. When we need less proof, we rush less. And when we rush less, we err less. In the mud, reducing error matters more than finding the correct answer quickly. These reflections do not make war pleasant. They do not dry the mud, but they help one's steps remain straight. To walk straight does not mean never to deviate. It means deviating and knowing how to return early. And returning early is the difference between bearable loss and irreparable catastrophe. For older listeners, this part does not invite becoming a philosopher. It invites becoming one who reminds himself. Each night, before sleep, one might place a few short questions beside the bed. What lay within reach today? What lay beyond it? Which reactions need correction? Which dignities need preserving? Not for self-blame, but for self-adjustment. Over time, that steadiness creates an inner safe zone, a place to return when the world grows too loud. The lines, "to myself," will continue, rhythmic and steady, until they become a low background music. Not overpowering, but always present. That music does not end the war, but it helps a person pass through the war without losing themselves. Yet self-observation does not exempt one from the moral paradox of power. When pressure rises and order is threatened, some decisions force a choice between two incomplete goods. In the next part of the story, these reflections will face their most challenging test. When virtue does not automatically prevail, and systems bend what one believes to be right. There, philosophy will no longer be a gentle reminder, but a painful question about the limits of morality when one holds power. Some paradoxes emerge only when a person has held power long enough. They are not paradoxes of theory, but of action. In such moments, values believed to be sound in private life become difficult to preserve unchanged when one must operate a vast system. Universal dignity, The idea that every human being deserves respect collides directly with the demand for stability in an empire under pressure from all sides. During those years, a small but resolute community began to be viewed with suspicion, not because of its size, but because it did not dissolve. Its members refused shared rituals, declined participation in binding social symbols, and placed their loyalty within a different order altogether. To the system, this difference was not merely religious, it was an administrative risk. For systems do not fear belief. They fear beliefs that cannot be predicted. Repression, in this context, did not erupt as personal rage. It unfolded as an administrative reflex. Decisions were made not to punish evil, but to prevent instability. And it is here that the paradox reveals itself. A person deeply committed to human dignity becomes the one who signs decisions that harm human beings, not out of malice, but because morality is stretched by the system. For those who have lived many years, this is a hard truth to accept. We want to believe that once morality is correct, it will automatically prevail. History shows otherwise. Morality requires structure to endure. When structure prioritizes stability at all costs, personal ethics are compelled to retreat, yielding space to collective order. And in that retreat, cracks appear, quietly but persistently. He did not justify repression with ornate language, nor did he transform it into triumph. These decisions were placed precisely where they belonged, imperfect choices in a world that does not permit perfection. This does not lessen the pain of those who were oppressed, but it helps us understand something more important. When power operates, good intentions do not exempt dire consequences. Perhaps the most painful aspect of this paradox is the internal division it creates. On one side stand reflections on virtue, justice, and treating human beings as human beings. On the other hand, reports of instability, spreading risk, and the cost of tolerance during a crisis. When these forces pull in opposite directions, decisions cease to be questions of right versus wrong, and become matters of choosing what destroys less. For older listeners, this recalls many familiar experiences. There are times when we are forced to do things not fully aligned with our ideals in order to protect those who depend on us. Families, communities, institutions all place us in dilemmas where no option is clean. Maturity lies not in never encountering paradox, but in clearly recognizing what one is sacrificing. The paradox of power also exposes the limits of philosophy when it stands apart from structure. Private reflections help a person keep his axis, but they cannot by themselves change how systems respond to threats. For morality to prevail, it requires law, institutional design, and time. When these are insufficient, personal ethics easily become a lonely voice amid demands for immediate stability. He understood this painfully, not through a single moment of awakening, but through the accumulation of difficult decisions. Each signature, each silence, each prioritization of order moved him further from a portion of his ideals. And precisely because he knew this, he did not allow that distance to harden into numbness. Awareness cannot erase consequences, but it prevents them from becoming invisible. Here, a quiet lesson emerges. Virtue does not automatically win when one holds power. On the contrary, power exposes the weaknesses of virtue when it lacks supporting structures. This is not an indictment of the individual, but a warning to those who come after. If universal dignity is to endure, it must not be cultivated only within hearts. Mechanisms must be built to protect it when pressure intensifies. For listeners seeking calm, this part does not show pessimism. It invites gentle lucidity. Recognizing that the world is more complex than our wishes does not make us cold. It makes us more humble in judgment. When we understand that much harm arises from structure, we are less hasty in assigning personal blame and better able to devote energy to improving what can be improved. The paradox of power offers no neat solution. It leaves behind an open question, carried like a light engraving in the mind. How does one preserve dignity when the system forces the prioritization of stability? That question is not answered fully here. It is held for the choices that follow, where tolerance, personal loss, and family tragedy will place even greater pressure on the leader's decisions. In the next part of the story, this paradox will reach into the deepest layer of private life, where betrayal, rumor, and educational failure force confrontation with the final limit of power. We may control order, but we cannot control the outcomes of those we love. Some blows do not come from enemies beyond the borders, but from places we believe to be safest. When betrayal appears, it does not require drums. It enters through familiarity, through relationships once entrusted with confidence. And precisely because of that, its cut is deeper, slower, and longer lasting. The revolt of Cassius arrived like a fracture in solid stone, not a grand conspiracy, but an accumulation of ambition, resentment, and opportunity. When the reports reached him, the habitual reflex of power was clear. Suppress swiftly, punish harshly, deter the rest. But reflex is not destiny. In the moment of decision, he chose a different path, one whose benefits were not immediately visible. He refused to turn betrayal into a lingering wound. Files were burned. Names were left unread, not out of indulgence, but to break the cycle of vengeance. He understood that punishment might extinguish the visible flame, yet leave embers hot enough to ignite again. Mercy, in this case, was not weakness. It was a strategy against civil war. For those who have lived long, this lesson is familiar, yet challenging. There are moments when preserving peace does not mean winning an argument, but preventing the argument from becoming an identity. Forgiveness does not erase betrayal, but it can stop betrayal from solidifying into collective memory. And sometimes, stopping that is worth more than a military victory. But betrayal was not the only loss. On the private plane, rumors, suspicion, and eventually the departure of a life partner brought a pain no decree could manage. Power teaches nothing about intimate loss. It only demands continuity. In that void, he learned a bitter truth. The throne does not shelter private life from the rain. Days of grief were not permitted to interrupt responsibility, yet pain, when compressed, finds another exit. It emerged as fatigue, as nights longer than usual, as lines written to himself, shorter, stricter in tone, not to lament, but to prevent pain from turning into bitterness. To achieve that, under these conditions, was a quiet victory. Then came the hardest tragedy, the tragedy of a father. Looking at his heir, he faced a painful paradox. The virtue can be taught, but it cannot be compelled. No environment, no counsel, no example is unlimited in reach. Some lessons are absorbed only when the inner world is ready, and some inner worlds are not prepared, regardless of effort. Here, power revealed its final boundary. He could design structures to limit risk. He could divide authority, install safeguards, and erect barriers. But he could not transmit inner discipline by command. He could not require another human being to live according to reflections distilled over a lifetime. The tragedy lay not in failed education, but in the illusion that education alone could replace structure and environment. For older listeners, this touches the most familiar pain. Not everything we believe to be right will be embraced by those we love. Not every careful effort produces the hoped-for result. To be a parent, a guide, a guardian, eventually means accepting that influence has limits. Acceptance is not abandonment. It is setting expectations to the accurate scale of human agency. Between public betrayal and private tragedy, a quiet question emerges. Why preserve virtue if it guarantees no outcome? The answer does not arrive as comfort. It comes as a survival principle. Preserve virtue so as not to become what you oppose. When the world denies a graceful ending, what remains is the manner of passage. He did not turn pain into an excuse for excessive hardness, nor did he use mercy to disguise reality. He continued to place structure above sentiment, knowing that structure protects the many when emotions fluctuate. And in doing so, he accepted a personal loss, the peace of mind of a father. Betrayal was neutralized through calculated clemency. Loss was carried through emotional discipline. The tragedy of fatherhood was faced with a truth difficult to swallow. Power cannot repair everything we love. These 3 layers of pain accumulated into the heaviest burden of his reign. And yet, within that burden, the core quality emerged, not through victory, but through the ability not to let pain lead. From this point on, final decisions no longer sought perfection. They sought durability, the durability of order, the durability of character, the durability of a legacy that did not wager everything on an heir, but on inner habits sown more widely than politics itself. And so, as private losses closed without resolution, the story approached its end. Politics might fade, dynasties might change, but something else would survive, not through power, but through the persistent repetition of small things. In the final part, we will encounter the only empire that cannot be betrayed, the empire of the mind, where reflections require no successor, only a reader, to continue living after politics has passed. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, it slows down, and it stops searching for a neat conclusion. For there are lives that do not close with a victory, but with durability, something that remains after the drums fall silent and the maps change color. The final years passed under accumulated fatigue. The body weakened, the borders were unsettled, power was no longer a position, but a weight, pressing evenly upon each day. Stationed far from Rome, amid cold winds and delayed reports, he understood that what was nearing its end was not only a human life, but a way of governing. And when that way ended, history would not pause to offer a gracious farewell. That is precisely what followed. After he was gone, politics failed to keep its accustomed rhythm. The successor did not carry the inner discipline forged in the mud, nor the habit of self-examination before action. What had been built through patience and restraint was, in a short time, eroded by display and impulse. Measured by the standards of power, this story could be told as a sequence of failures, fragile stability, immature decisions, a political legacy that quickly fractured. But one thing did not follow that trajectory. The lines written for himself, those short, evenly paced reflections, turned inward rather than outward, continued their journey. They required no patron, no ceremony. They moved quietly across centuries, across languages, into small rooms where weary people searched for something to lean on. As politics faded, the empire of the mind came into view. What is striking is this. Those lines promise no cheap consolation. They do not reassure that everything will be fine. They simply remind us how to stand firm when everything is not. That modesty is what allows them to endure. They demand no belief. They seek no admiration. They ask only one small thing, repeated again and again. Attend to your reactions. Preserve dignity in action. Accept impermanence without surrender. For listeners who have lived many years, this is the most tangible legacy of all. Because at a certain age, one understands that not everything brilliant is durable. Loud words exhaust. Large systems collapse. What remains is habit. The habit of keeping one's breath steady. The habit of speaking less when less is needed. The habit of doing what is right, even when no one is watching. Such habits do not require a dynasty to survive. They require people. The empire of the mind has no borders. It collects no taxes. It issues no punishments. It exists only in the moment between stimulus and response, where a human being still has a choice. Each time we choose restraint over impulse, fairness over convenience, self-correction before correcting others, that empire expands a little further, quietly, unmeasured, but durable. Some ask, then what was the most significant achievement? Not the preservation of a throne, not the survival of a dynasty, but the preservation of inner integrity when the world repeatedly demands that it be traded away. In war, in plague, and in moral paradoxes without clean answers, keeping the inner self from distortion is already a silent victory. This does not make life easy. It only makes life endurable. And in a world where endurance is often mistaken for weakness, this is a necessary reminder. Disciplined endurance is long-term strength. It allows people to pass through upheaval without losing their capacity for care, without losing fairness, without losing a rhythm just sufficient to continue. These reflections also teach a final lesson about power. Power does not own the world. The world does not belong to those who create it, nor to those who rule it. The world merely passes through people, leaving consequences behind. When this is understood, one clings less to outcomes and attends more carefully to the manner of action. Outcomes can be taken away. The manner of action remains. If there is a lullaby for this ending, it can be very brief. When the long day closes, return to what lies within reach. Set burdens down where they belong. Accept what cannot be changed. Protect what can be protected. Tomorrow the world may still be loud, but if the inner world has not broken, one still possesses an empire, the hardest to govern and the most enduring of all. And so, the story closes not with a crash, but with an even breath. History continues, as it always does. Yet somewhere, in small rooms before sleep, someone opens a page, reads a few short lines, and feels a little steadier. Enough to rest, enough to wake tomorrow and continue living with decency.